there's nothing worse than trying to fight for your fantasy life. You're trying to get into the playoffs, and then the next thing you know, you're without your stud quarterback. A guy like Lamar Jackson, Jaden Daniels, or even Bo Nix. Week 14 is the worst time for the NFL to have 6 teams on bye. So who are the top 20 quarterbacks in Week 14? We're talking about it right now. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone had a great Thanksgiving week. Welcome to Week 14 here, where yes, we have 6 teams on a bye. Horrible timing for the NFL to have 6 teams on bye. It is apparent at this point they do not care about your fantasy football team. But that's all right, because if you're a part of Headliner Nation, you know we're here to get done. So let's go ahead and dive into the top 20 rankings here for Week 14. However, before we start with that, let's take a look at some of my bigger hits and misses from just last week. And we'll go ahead and look at the hits first. Guys like Jaden Daniels, Joe Burrow, and Kirk Cousins. Now for Jaden Daniels, he had been a little bit consistent as of late, but I kept him up inside Tier 1. He finished as the QB 2. How about Joe Burrow? I dropped him down to a Verge top 10 play last week. He ended up finishing as the quarterback 11. And then Kirk Cousins. I didn't even rank him up inside my top 20 last week, and he had an absolutely horrific game. But I had some big time misses, guys like Jameis Winston, Caleb Williams, and Bryce Young. Now, when it comes to Jameis Winston, I kind of looked at last week as a trap game for Jameis, and the turnovers, they were there. But so was almost 500 yards of passing and 4 touchdowns. I had Jameis ranked way too low. How about Caleb Williams? I didn't know if Week 12 was a fluke or the new norm in Chicago. Well, he absolutely killed it in Week 13, so it wasn't just a fluke. Another guy I had ranked way too low. And then lastly, Bryce Young. It is just so hard for me to trust him starting on my fantasy football team. There are so many other options out there that I just feel better about each and every week, but Bryce Young continued his hot streak and finished as the QB 8, another guy I had ranked way too low. But now we move forward to Week 14. Let's go ahead and bring up Tier 1 for the quarterback position, and this is where I have the likes of Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow, Sam Darnold, and Baker Mayfield. Now for Josh Allen, he's going up against the Rams. And the worst part about Josh Allen rest of season is he could be pulled in the fourth quarter of games if Buffalo is absolutely rolling their opponent. Now the Rams, at least they have the weapons to keep pace, and Allen has had at least 20 fantasy points in every game since Week 5. The Rams kind of mid against opposing quarterbacks, so Josh Allen this week, QB1. Then we have Jalen Hurts going up against Carolina, and he really needs some healthy weapons. We know that Devontae Smith hasn't been out there in quite some time, but now Dallas Goedert is questionable as well. Jalen Hurts hasn't had over 20 fantasy points now in 3 straight games, but he's going up against Carolina, who allows the 6th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. Could give him a little bit of an opportunity to run this week. Then we got Joe Burrow going up against Dallas, the current quarterback 3 overall. He's had 20 plus fantasy points in 4 straight games. He's had at least 3 touchdowns in 4 straight games. And even though Cincinnati may not be able to win a game, the fantasy points are aplenty right now. Another great chance for a big game this week going up against Dallas, who does allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. Then we got Sam Darnold going up against Atlanta, and he's been hot as of late. 3 straight games over 18 fantasy points ever since that Week 10 disaster. He's been doing it without having big games from Justin Jefferson as well, and you have to think that one of those big games is probably coming pretty soon. Now, the Falcons played well against LA last week, but prior to that, had allowed over 260 yards passing in 3 of their last 4 games, so Sam Darnold going up against the Falcons this week, I got him at number 4. Number 5 is the Bake Show, Baker Mayfield going up against Las Vegas. And Baker has kind of cooled off here as of late. He's had less than 13 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games, only has 3 passing touchdowns over his last 3 games. But Las Vegas is way easier to throw on. They allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, so Baker Mayfield right here at the bottom of Tier 1. Then we move down to Tier 2, where we got the likes of Jordan Love, Justin Herbert, Kyler Murray, Jared Goff, Patrick Mahomes, Russell Wilson, Tua Tagovailoa, Matthew Stafford, Caleb Williams, and Jameis Winston. Yes, Tier 2 is absolutely packed. And it's like that because all of these guys possess the ability to finish up inside the top 10 to 12 quarterbacks this week. But we'll start off with Jordan Love going up against Detroit. Now, Love has had multiple touchdowns in 8 of 10 games this year. The other 2 games, though, he had 0. One of those games was against this Detroit defense just a few weeks ago. Detroit has allowed under 200 yards passing, in fact, in 3 of their last 4, but Caleb Williams put up 26 fantasy points against them just last week, so Jordan Love right here in tier 2. Then we got Justin Herbert going up against Kansas City, and when Herbert doesn't run, it absolutely kills his fantasy ceiling. Last week, he had a whole 1 yard rushing. Prior to that, he'd had at least 49 yards rushing or a rushing touchdown in 4 of his last 5 games. The good news is Kansas City has been torched through the air over their last 3 games. They're now allowing the 11th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. Then we got Kyler Murray going up against Seattle. Kyler has had 2 pretty bad games this year. One of them came against Seattle 2 weeks ago. He only has 2 passing touchdowns now over the last month of the season, and that is not ideal. This offense has just been so vanilla. We really need to see Kyler Murray run the ball this week against a Seattle passing defense who's been playing great here as of late. Now, after Kyler, we go down to Jared Goff going up against Green Bay, and he remains extremely boom or bust. Over the last 6 games, he's only hit 17 fantasy points or more 1 time. Detroit is just so hard to rely on weekly. They can literally win a game by multiple scores and not even throw for any touchdowns. They can also go out and have Jared Goff throw for 400 yards and 4 touchdowns. They are truly one of the best teams in the NFL that can beat you either on the ground or through the air. Now, earlier in the season against Green Bay, Jared Goff only threw the ball for 145 yards and a touchdown. But with no Jair Alexander this week for Green Bay, let's see if Jared Goff can have a little bit more of a ceiling day. Then we got Patrick Mahomes going up against the Chargers. And well, he's better now than he was to start the season, but the ceiling is just so much lower than what we want it to be for Patrick Mahomes. But at least we realize that now. He's had at least 16 fantasy points in 6 straight ball games. He's a solid low-end QB1 each and every week. And we also know the Chargers are easier to throw on than run on. They allow 16 fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, which once again makes Patrick Mahomes a verge QB1. Then we got Russell Wilson going up against Cleveland. The rematch of a game just a couple of weeks ago. In that game, Russell Wilson had 270 yards and 1 touchdown, but man, did he just mushroom stamp the Bengals last week, where he had 414 yards passing and 3 touchdowns. Pittsburgh still needs to keep winning ball games to take this division, though. The Cleveland defense allows right around the league average to opposing quarterbacks, so Russell Wilson once again finds himself up inside the top 12 at number 11. At number 12, this is where I got Tua Tagovailoa going up against the Jets, and he's now put together back-to-back great fantasy games, averaging 330 yards and 3 touchdowns just over his last 2 alone. And if we're being honest, this week's matchup isn't going to be much tougher than what he faced last week in Green Bay. Now, he doesn't have a game against the Jets with multiple touchdowns since 2021, which is not ideal, but this is a team that cannot afford to lose, so Tua right here at number 12. 13 is Matthew Stafford going up against Buffalo. He's had at least 16 fantasy points in 5 of his last 6 games, but Demarcus Robinson did suffer a hand injury last week and is now questionable to play. But the Rams are still fighting for the division, and Buffalo has already clinched. This is not some easy matchup, but one that LA has to try to win. How are they going to win? By throwing the ball to Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp. How about Caleb Williams next going up against San Francisco? The offense is starting to get back on track and is turning pass heavy. Over the last 2 games, Chicago has averaged 43 pass attempts per contest. Caleb Williams has 5 touchdowns over his last 2 games. And that right there is a big change, since he had 0 passing touchdowns in the prior 4 games. Now a matchup going up against San Francisco, who does allow just over 16 fantasy points per game, but that defense is banged up, so Caleb Williams up inside tier 2. How about Jameis Winston going up against Pittsburgh again? And no one in the NFL is more enjoyable to watch than Jameis Winston. We all know the interceptions are going to happen. They have his entire career, but they can be lived with in fantasy football when the guy goes out and throws for 497 yards and 4 touchdowns. Now, he didn't do that in their last game against Pittsburgh just 2 weeks ago. He only had 219 yards and no touchdowns, but that was a snow game, and I'm not going to hold it against him. The way that Jameis is playing right now and throwing the ball down the field, I had to keep him up inside tier 2. which means all we have left is Tier 3, Geno Smith, Brock Purdy, Cooper Rush, Aiden O'Connell, and Will Levis. For Geno Smith, he's going up against Arizona, and it's another week of not knowing whether or not he's going to have DK Metcalf. Now, Geno hasn't really been some weekly high ceiling play, but he hasn't sucked either. He's the current quarterback 12 overall on the year, but that Arizona defense has been solid the second half of the season. They allow right around 16.3 fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, so Geno Smith is at the top of Tier 3. Then we got Brock Purdy going up against Chicago, and San Francisco just lost Christian McCaffrey and Jordan Mason. Now, nothing against Isaac Guerrero, but you have to think that San Francisco is going to throw the ball a little bit more this week. Unfortunately, it's not the easiest of matchups to do so. Chicago, they allow the second fewest fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, and Deebo Samuel at this point might as well retire because he's not doing anything on the field. How about Cooper Rush going up against Cincinnati? And I'm pretty sure at this point, I could go out there and throw 225 yards and 2 touchdowns against Cincinnati myself. They just got teabagged by Russell Wilson last week. Now, Cooper Rush, he scored at least 17 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games. We could be getting back Jake Ferguson, and Cincinnati allows almost 22 fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. So yes, I had to include Cooper Rush for the matchup alone. Speaking of matchups, how about Aiden O'Connell going up against Tampa Bay? He got his job back last week, came in against Kansas City, put up 340 yards and 2 touchdowns against them. His running game is still banged up, and now he gets a matchup going up against Tampa Bay, who allows the second most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. Plus, we also know that Tampa Bay can put points up on the board, forcing Las Vegas to play from behind all 4 quarters. And then lastly, I'm going with Will Levis going up against Jacksonville. 4 straight games now with at least 16 fantasy points is enough for us to consider him in a week like this, especially in a matchup going up against Jacksonville, who allows the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks in the NFL. This is really going to be a battle to find out which team sucks less. And with Jacksonville dealing with so many injuries, Will Levis made it inside the top 20 right here in Tier 3. All right, so there you have our Week 14 quarterback rankings. Hopefully there's just enough production out there to get us by Week 14 and catapult us into the fantasy playoffs. Now, if you enjoyed today's show, do me a favor by hitting the like button if you haven't already, and I don't care that it's already Week 14. If you're not subscribed, now is the time to do so, because we absolutely will blow your mind even in the off season. Now, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here today, but hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headline